And long story short, I got bit. There isn't an anti-venom for them. Long story short, it ended up being 9 months out of work, 6 surgeries. I lost a truck. I lost a house. I lost a dog. It was essentially a real life country song. The story was a single night, and if we wanted to go from the tree, then we had to follow a Kaluga up the tree. If we had to get down, then a flying gecko had to take us down. Now we're at the vampire crabs. The vampire crabs go to the water. Now we're in the water, and we're kind of following the direction of these scenes, which was a lot of, okay, we have this. How do we piece this together? But at the end, what we got was a fluid story. What's funny is I've actually spoken at a fish show and I've spoken at fish clubs on this topic because predatory fish keepers are fascinated by them. I've spoken in Florida and South Carolina, kind of been flown around to different fish groups talking about this because they're actually better suited than most herp keepers generally to take on something like this. So when I say aquatic snakes, I'm meaning primarily fully aquatic snakes.
Can you imagine a world where losing a large chunk of your left thumb actually turns out to be one of the best things that's ever happened to you? Well, that is the story of our guest today, Myke Clarkson. Myke is a TV producer. He's worked on huge networks, including A&E, ABC, and History, as well as some of the more popular nature networks like Discovery, Animal Planet, and Nat Geo. He's worked on Shark Week, as well as was the producer on a very popular series called Dead by Dawn on National Geographic Wild. He has a huge amount of experience producing TV. We discuss how he lost his thumb and how that redirected his life into this new world of producing TV, which he never thought he would ever get into. We discuss balancing the educational side of nature documentaries with the sort of sensationalism and how to get people to watch the shows without sort of deviating too far from the truth and reality. That's a fascinating part of this conversation. The last half of this conversation is about aquatic snake keeping and how Myke got into it. And it's really a general kind of broad overview. It's something we've never discussed on the podcast at all. And really, it's almost a complete outside world of conventional reptile keeping. There's so many different things to keep in mind. So if you are somebody who is looking for a complex project, if you're someone that has an intense ability to go down rabbit holes and research like many of us do, then this is an episode that you'll absolutely want to listen to. Even if aquatic snakes have never even come across your mind, it's something that you thought you had never even been interested in, I promise you listening to Myke talk about them will make you start researching them and actually make you potentially want to pick one up yourself. There is a ton of information in this episode, but if you are interested in it and you guys feel that we should do an episode that deep dives into one or two species with Myke, let me know in the comments because I think he's the absolute person to do it with and I would love to do that with him. So if aquatic snakes are something that's interesting to the audience, we'll dig into it a little bit more. But until then, thank you for watching the episode and enjoy, and I will talk to you after. This podcast is all about improving your reptile husbandry. However, I know not everybody has the time or the money to go out and spend thousands of dollars doing custom builds. Thankfully, friend of the podcast, Josh Halter, aka the Bio Dude, is working hard to make better care more accessible. He makes turnkey bioactive kits for leopard geckos, ball pythons, tortoises, invertebrates, dart frogs, and the list continues to grow. He has spent years testing and perfecting these handcrafted substrates and dietary supplements to create the most effective products. If you visit thebiodude.com, you will see he is a proud supporter of both USARK and responsible reptile keeping, and there is an option to donate to either at checkout. Well, Myke, welcome to the podcast. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Just as we were chatting off air, I'm actually interested because you had mentioned that you had a show on HerpNation radio, and people have heard me say this before, that was one of the, I'm trying to think, it was like 2015, 2016, and I used to listen to like all those shows, and I don't remember your show, but I just because it was so long ago now, and maybe it was... Yeah, I'm so sorry, but that was one of the motivating factors for me to start the podcast because I was so sad to see it disappear, and I just really loved the variety of people at the different shows and whatnot. So, what was your show?
It was the Snake Master Mike show. It ran for about, I think, 2 years. It was one of the longer running ones. We never got any data in terms of viewership, but I know Scott Waters is the head of HerpNation, was pretty happy with it. It was the Snake Master Mike program, and the format was like the first 10 or 15 minutes would be what's going on in herp culture and herp news, and kind of a mix of here's a cool science news thing. Someone just bred this cool thing. Hey, Louisiana, watch out. Like I take the US ARC alerts and make sure to include that. We followed that by a segment with a guest. So kind of like what we're doing now. My first one for the whole podcast is Jewel Sylvester. But we talk about a topic and kind of that would be the bulk of it. And then we wrap up with what was a terrible idea. but I was younger, so I just used that as my escape hatch. What I called the comedy cool down, which was inspired by, if you remember, old school, like older radio, AM radio, late night, the Phil Hendry show,
Mm.
which was a comedy radio show where the host was both the guests and the host, but he didn't let that on, and his guests were basically terrible people. So then the callers would call in yelling at the guest, and then the host would yell at the guest, but the guest and the host were the same people. I did something similar like that, but I brought a bunch of friends over to play characters, and we did like a whole like comedy segment just to do something different because we were kind of already edging into that TV 14 rating, PG-13 kind of section of podcasts, which was kind of the demo that Scott had said, like, hey, just shoot for the heavy hitting, shoot from the hips, don't smooth it out too much. So we went for that. It was kind of like the slightly edgier version. It was fun, but
Yeah.
it was just kind of nonsense.
Yeah, I really enjoyed that time of podcasting. That, like I said, I'm sure I listened to your show because I did listen to a lot of them, and it was like it was an inspiration for me to start this. So that's really cool to hear that history. I'd love to know a little bit more about your history. Today we're going to talk a lot about aquatic snakes, and when I'm looking at your bio, it sounds like that was maybe a passion early on because you were potentially going to progress into a PhD studying aquatic snakes. And so I'd love to know about that. And then, there was a left-hand turn at one point due to a snake bite. So maybe I'll let you take it from there.
Literal left hand.
Good guess on my part.
Yeah, no. So my original aspiration in life, of course, everyone goes through that high school. They think they're going to be a rock star, and I did that pretty strongly, where I momentarily stepped away from science. But even like you go all the way back to my childhood, and field herping and keeping herps was what motivated me to be a house sitter and mow lawns and work because my parents said you can have snakes, you got to take care of them. So herps were definitely a part of my childhood. I went to some of the herp shows in San Diego some 30 plus years ago and was part of the Herp Society. High school thought I'd be a rock star, opened for Journey, had a song on the radio, thought that's where life was going to go. But then once
That's
that
pretty
kind of all
good.
simmered, yeah, yeah. So, hit a point, but then I got to the point where, okay, college, you need to do something serious. My favorite snakes are sea snakes. At the time, Brian Fry and the Shine Lab were both doing some work with that. I was friends with Fry. So I was kind of hoping like, okay, let's study under Fry. He's still a friend. So it was kind of funny that like he was doing all the venom work. I've always been fascinated by sea snakes. That's the direction I want to go with my life. In fact, it was yellow-bellied sea snakes that which I have tattoo sleeved on my arm and my car license plate. And everyone knows I'm the guy a little obsessed with Pelamis or now Hydrophis. So that was the game plan. Somewhere along the way, there was some interest doing some venom research on stiletto snakes. And at the time, I'd been keeping a ton of South African colubrids and colubroids. And they are actually allowed in California to this day. And I've kind of always thought because I went public with my bite, they might do something about it, but I was the only one that was keeping them. They're not the greatest captives, but they still haven't. So I looked it up. There wasn't any problem keeping them. The researcher that wanted to do the studies, I'm like, yeah, I can keep them. And then next time you're in town, we'll do the milking. And long story short, I got bit. Um, I was
Is there a
23.
is like when you look at a stiletto snake, it looks like a nightmare to try to extract venom from. Like typically you're talking about like front fanged snakes. It looks fairly simple. I mean, I'm not someone that would do it, but it looks pretty simple. You're puncturing the cup, but when you look at a stiletto snake, the fangs are not in a convenient location
Yeah,
to extract. It
no.
seems like.
I think Kentucky Reptile Zoo has figured out methods, and obviously Jim is kind of a uh, expert at extracting from weird snakes, and stilettos definitely follow that mandate. Now, I should clarify, I was not the milking end of this ordeal. It was we'd like to work with these. You seem to have a knack for keeping these, obscure colubrids and colubroids alive. You want to try your hand at stilettos, and when I come back up, you'll be a part of the project.
Mm.
And at the time, I was breeding Telescopus semi-annuatus and Mahalia capensis, which is now was Lima Formosa now. Yeah, it was Goniantophis in between Mahalia. That one changed names a lot. But I had a lot of success first time breeding a lot of these obscure African snakes, which is kind of how I integrated the project. Like, hey, if you can get some, let's do this. Yeah, and there isn't an anti-venom for them. Long story short, it ended up being 9 months out of work, six surgeries. I lost a truck, I lost a house, I lost a dog. It was essentially a real life country song, and if I could say that was my all time low. Like literally, I had lost pretty much at 23 everything I had. I'd bought a pet store and right before the bite actually, and quite fortunately, it turned out the books were cooked, so I had to unravel that and go back to a job I absolutely hated, which was spraying cockroaches in restaurants. But that was my 18 years old. My dad had worked for the company, so it's my first job out of high school. Um, had to go back to that, and it was humbling. And it was a crap year, to be perfectly honest. I wouldn't dread going back to it. But what ended up happening was, the story Carl Schmidt and the Boomslong actually. Schmidt did the Boomslong journal as he died from it and kind of just wrote it all out because what else are you going to do? Um, so I got bit by the stiletto snake, transferring it from containers, not trying to use my hands, but trying to use improper tools, user error. And I figured I'm gonna Schmidt myself, but the modern version. And at the time, the modern version was MySpace, which dates this story a little bit. But I half hour by half hour took photos and kind of described what was going on. I had blood pressure cuff and kind of self-documented from home, going there. Well, let's see what happens. In hindsight, because the vasoconstrictor, I do have cardiovascular history. I probably should go in the hospital. But at the time, I hit up a few friends who had some bad advice. So like, you're either gonna die or not. So just like write it out. Um, so yeah, so I did that, and that was found by a TV producer. Now, to me at this time, TV was just some ivory tower. That you didn't really get into unless you knew someone, which isn't entirely untrue, but it's not also as true as I thought it was. And but they hit me up and I'm like, yeah, I'm not interested. To me, the damage done to my reputation by like being on one of those shows where you're sobbing, like, oh, the animal attacked me, is not a good look for the animals. But they said we want to do a more scientific approach. We've got Sean Bush coming on, we're gonna be talking about the venom. And I'm still like, okay, that sounds better, guys. And the end product I thought was actually a pretty good take on, the animal bite programming sector because it did focus on more of the science. But I was like, no, no, no. And then they came back with $8,000. And when you're 23 and you're in medical debt, you say yes to $8,000. So
Of
I did
course.
that. I said yes, much to my wife's chagrin, and I think she was actually wiser there because the fallout was at the time I had helped found the North American Field Herping Association with Jeff Lem and a few others that was born from the Field Herp Forum. I realized we're all in the same area. Let's go hang out. So like I planned meetings, and then that eventually blossomed into a great organization. I actually resigned after my bite because so many people were giving me a hard time for doing the TV show, and I get it. But anyways, sorry. ADHD sidetracks. Well, you'll get used to that. I'm used to it. It's all
Yeah,
good.
yeah, yeah. No, all the listeners, half of them have ADHD, so they're tracking this. Reptile
Perfect, because
people.
it's like chasing a centipede that's really confused.
Exactly.
But so I did the TV show, and then on set they were talking about different accounts, and I couldn't keep my mouth shut. 23-year-old. I know you always feel like at that age you know everything and you have to share it, which I started doing. And they asked me to come back in because their regular animal guy was going to be moving into a show. And I was like, okay, I'll be your animal consultant, fact check your information and do animal handling. And I did that for a while. And it was fun. I was like, hey, this is gonna be a cool story to tell. I got to dip my toe in the TV world through the snake world. And it just got too much. I was struggling to keep up with coursework. I had my day job, which was not something I loved, but it was getting me through this time. At the time, my wife was going to nursing school, so I was the only income. And I said, "Hey, look, guys, like and I hadn't lost the house yet. I'm like, I'm trying not to lose my house. I'm struggling with work. Um, I can't do this too." And they're like, what are you making your day job? And on the spot offered me a job. And I just worked a whole day shift and the job was a night shift. So I worked the whole night shift in my uniform for my day job the first night and slept under the desk that morning because I was too tired to drive home. But they started me as their consulting producer slash you'll digitize the tapes. Because like, how are you with electronics? I used to work in web hosting, pretty decent. And then Fukushima happened.
Mm-mm.
And once again, I was like, oh, well, it was a cool experience. But Fukushima happened and that destroyed all the tape stock. And as a tape digitizer, I no longer had a job because there's no longer tapes. Because they basically said, hey, we'll make you the consulting producer and the digitizer. And then digitizing went away. So I said, thanks. Have a
So the
good.
tapes get damaged from radiation? Is that or what?
Yeah, sorry. I might have skipped something. You want me to go back and try to clarify that?
Yeah,
I,
yeah.
I apologize. I will say I haven't had my coffee yet. So this is just running on wake up natural, which is rare for me. Actually, it's not coffee, that's water. Too bad. Sorry about this. I'll start. So, essentially, I told them I can't do this, my day job and the coursework, and they said that's fine. We actually have a job. We need someone to digitize the tapes because back then everything was shot on tape. And I said, cool, no problem. I used to work web hosting. I'm a quick learner on computers. I'll do consulting, producing, and this night shift digitizing. And if you're paying me the same, why not? This will be a really fun story to share someday. So I got into digitizing. I quickly worked my way up to assistant editing and digitizing, but then Fukushima happened, and the radiation destroyed so much of the tape stockpiles that a single HD cam tape went from like $100 to $1,000. So all
That
the
is
reality
crazy. I had no idea that much radiation hit the West Coast.
well, no, all the tape stock comes from Japan.
Oh, I see what
So
you're saying. Okay, I was like, how did it do? I was
yeah,
like,
tape
I thought it
stock's
was.
not made in the
Yeah, I'm
States.
like, how do you guys not have cancer? I see what you're saying. So there was just no film being made essentially. So you weren't getting.
Basically,
Yeah,
all the film in Japan got destroyed. The warehouses were too close to that area,
gotcha.
and
Okay.
they weren't keeping up with production. And at the same time, reality TV was making its name and really building into a big thing. And
Mm,
by the way, when I say reality TV, it's often confusing. Reality TV and unscripted TV are essentially the same thing. If you're watching Jeopardy, that's unscripted. If you're watching Planet Earth, that's unscripted. And if you're watching Honey Boo Boo, that's also unscripted. And oftentimes the industry reality and unscripted are interchanged, even though a lot of people have an association reality with being like that hair pull drama stuff. But at the time, reality was like, hey, we're the affordable option. And tapes going to $1,000 tape wasn't going to work because
mm.
we were shooting hundreds of tapes per show. So instantly, the industry switched digital and was like, tapes are over. We're switching the cameras. And within like 2 weeks, tapes were over. It was an insanely fast transition. But so was my job. And I said, okay, guess I'll go back to the grind for a new job and figure out what we're going to do here. And about a week later, I got a call saying, hey, you know that show you were developing with the other producer in the office? And I said, the nature show? Like, yeah, would you like to be an associate producer? Which, to be fair, at the time, I had no idea what that was. Like, I was like, I basically like put on the movie The Producers with Matthew Broderick and was like, I guess I run around and sing that I'm a producer. I want to be a producer or something. I'm not sure exactly what happens next. I learned, but I had no film school background. What ended up happening is we made Speed of Life for Discovery Channel, 3-part doc that I'm still pretty proud of. I think it holds up for the camera tech. We did some crazy inventive camera rigging that hasn't been replicated since. And it was fun. It was a good experience. Finished that. And so got to go to Africa for the first time, Costa Rica the second time. So for me, it was like I got a passport for my honeymoon to go to Costa Rica. I never thought I'd use it again, ever. I thought like at the time you didn't need it for Mexico, really. Your driver's license was fine. So I'm like, yeah, I'll get a stamp, and this is my Costa Rica souvenir. Just a handful of years later, I'm going to Africa and Costa Rica. I feel like, oh my gosh, I've traveled the world now, which is funny in hindsight. And so the job went away. I'm like, okay, whatever. A few weeks later, they said, hey, we got this show, Auction Hunters, with your friend Ton Jones. Do you want to associate produce that? And the rest is history from there. The first 5 or 6 years, I kept telling myself, I'm just doing this to pay off my debt so I can return to school. I'm paying off my debt so I can return to school. And at that point, I'd been to like 20 countries with production and I was making a very generous income. And I actually went to a couple people like Fry going, what do you think I should do? Like, I've got a really good career and I didn't study in this, but I'm making more money than I would if I did finish my herpetology degree, and I'm getting to travel, and I've got downtime in between shows to do things, and I got a lot of people saying stick with it till it burns out, and so now, almost 18 years later, I'm still just sticking with it till it burns out. But
Yeah.
it turned out it was a field I was good at, and I had no idea because it's a lot of creativity, creative writing, which I've always enjoyed. Obviously, I write for Responsible Herpetoculture now. I've written articles for others, co-authored a few books. Writing is something that I enjoy. I'm sitting in a library right now, so um, it's a lot of writing. It's a lot of creativity. And if you're ADHD like me, which like, I'm sure a lot of listeners and a lot of hurt people are, we rabbit hole, right? Like
Mm.
we get obsessed about a certain kind of plant in a tank or a substrate, and we'll stay up till all hours until we know everything there is to know about it. Well, if you do that as a producer, you're just actually a good producer because now you're naturally inclined to research.
Yeah.
So that's kind of the weird backstory. But I think the takeaway is that my lowest point in life, the point that you would think about a time machine I'd erase, losing a thumb, 6 surgeries, a heart attack, financial collapse. I had to get rid of most of my herp collection because at that point I didn't have the money to upkeep it. I went from 486 snakes down to like 20. It was definitely like the lowest low, but it's also given me the life and the opportunities I've had. So, if I have a message, I don't know if I do, but if I do, it'd be, when stuff goes sideways and it feels like it can't get any worse, hang in there because you don't know where this is going to lead. Funny little anecdote in all of that is the person that caught the snake that bit me is one of my best friends, Devin Massang, who's now a also United States TV producer. If he hadn't caught that snake, the show he started on wouldn't have had its opportunity to be pitched because it was actually a mutual associate that pitched his show, brought him into TV, and now he lives in Ohio, is married, and a full-time TV producer. So both our lives entirely changed from a single incident snake bite that would have been something that most people are like, oh, I regret this year. I regret ever taking on this project. But in hindsight, I regret being careless enough that I got bit, but what it brought me is something that I never dreamed of. So I also am grateful, I guess, for the snake.
Yeah, yeah. I think that's really well said. I mean, it's one of those weird things where it's impossible to tell if what's happened to you is good or bad in the moment, and you have to look at it in hindsight and sort of an expanded bird's eye view. And suddenly, this one thing, like who wants to lose their thumb and go through all this stuff, suddenly has completely changed the trajectory of your life, and you get to have this incredible career that never would have happened. It's a really good reminder for people that when things are, it could not be worse. It actually somehow, even though you can't imagine, could actually be the right thing happening to you. It's a very weird thing. And as far as some of the TV stuff, can you list some of the things that you've worked on that are animal related with either Nat Geo or Discovery, or what are the networks you've worked on?
Yeah, so if I had my way, I would only do animal related content, and I do not hide that when I'm talking to people on TV. I'm like that's my passion. I've done non-animal related content to pay the bills, but and some of them unfortunately were really famous, and those are the ones I should ride coattails on, but I don't care about them. The animal programming is definitely my passion. So like
Although
Speed
I
of
do
Life for
love
Discovery.
shows like Auction Hunters and those types of things. I always watch those things.
Yeah, so I mean, the non-animal shows were like Auction Hunters. I did the pilot, and I think this is the first time I've ever said this in a podcast. But at this point, I don't. It's been long enough. It's a part of my life, and I feel like being honest about it's the way to do it. So I did do the pilot to Sizzle and the first season of Duck Dynasty.
Hmm.
I signed up for that one because I thought no one would ever watch these crazy rednecks out in the swamp. And Louisiana has really good herping, North Louisiana specifically, and they lived in the parish because that's what they call counties in Louisiana that with a really pretty buttermilk racer, which is the main reason. It was buttermilk racers and mud snakes are the reason I took the Duck Dynasty gig, thinking it would never become anything. And to date, that's the biggest show that was ever on cable TV. They will never be topped because the ratings have declined since then. So I could say I produced one of the biggest show in cable history. Um, but I was field producer on that. But then, yeah, like you said, Auction Hunters. I've done a lot of Shark Week, but the good Shark Week. And I hate to asterisk that, but if you're a marine bio or animal person, there are these Shark Weeks that are catered more for the general audience, the megalodons, the something bit me at the beach. And personally, that doesn't spark my interest. I don't. Shark attacks are less than 1% of our natural ecology. I want to know about the sharks. So I do more kind of the research and science oriented Shark Weeks most often. I've also done Shark Fest. So for Shark Week, Monster Mako got the first ever breach of a mako shark on camera in high speed. Did Impossible Shot, which was the first ever overhead breach of a great white shark. So, at the time, Planet Earth had done the horizontal breach, and Jeff Kerr with Air Jaws had kind of done the breach off the back of the boat, but no one had seen what the breach looks like from an aerial perspective. And there was a few different companies competing to get that shot first, and drones didn't exist yet, and the camera weighed like 12 pounds. So we actually had to do weather balloons, and there was another boat with a crane. But that was a really fun one because our small kind of ragtag team of 8 pulled it off before the giant big boats and who had tried 3 times before. So that was one of those. I got a Telly Award for that, which is a kind of silly award, but
That
still
must have
at
been a
that point in
crazy
my career.
moment, though, like when you're watching it occur. You
Oh
know,
man, we were out to sea for when we came back in at night, but we were pulling 18-hour days for 16 days solid at zero energy at that point. Like the water out there, you have pitch and swell, so your boat's just constantly rocking. If you don't hold on, you're not staying on. You're trying to work with camera gear, and in that kind of conditions, it's really tough to be looking at small electronics and trying to watch the edge of the water. So we're all physically just destroyed at this point, and we didn't get the shot until the very last day where we're like, we might get fired for this because we're going to go home empty-handed. And so it was, it was incredible to see. But I think the emotions of elation that we did it, were probably overwhelming. And then we went to the nearest bar and drank straw rum and Clippies and cola, and
Is this
which
in
are
South
African.
Africa?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Until more than any of us should have. And then actually, my assistant camera guy tried to teach me Muay Thai and accidentally really bruised his shin because we were both drinking too much to be practicing Muay Thai in a bar. Um, but that was an awesome one. Fast forward, Nat Geo used to have something called Big Cat Week. So produced a show called Man versus Lion. We don't get to pick the title, so sometimes I'm always like, it's not versus, but the networks do their studies on what's going to get eyes on it. At the end of the day, I don't always want just nature people watching my shows. I'd rather the general audience watch it because the nature people are already reached, right? Like we're
Mhm.
all going to watch this stuff, go, it's awesome. And that's, in my opinion, the most natural history television can do is plant the seed of, wow, nature's awesome. And that's really it. We can't teach you much. We can't change your mind about much. There's not enough time. If you're steadfast, that you don't, there's nothing wrong with the planet, the 1 hour doc's not going to change that. What I can do is show you some cool stuff. And if you go, huh, that's cool, and you get that spark, and then you start looking into it and you start Googling, and someday you wake up and you're like, I think I really like wildlife. Well, cool. We helped plant the seed. And that to me, as a wildlife producer, is my role. Help plant the seed. So in that kind of thought pattern, I developed a show called Dead by Dawn. So I created that show from just a random idea of people don't watch natural history in America. I'd looked into the ratings of Blue Planet 2, which was in Europe the biggest show of all time. It crashed servers. It caused internet outages in China. It really disrupted the world because it was that popular, except in America, where it didn't make the top 100 shows. Because at the time, I had a cat named Attenborough. He's since passed from old age. Um, it was all David Attenborough orchestral.
Mm.
I had a cat named Attenborough. I have no problem with Attenborough. I absolutely think he's a national treasure for the UK, and he is the voice of nature. It's going to be weird when it's not his voice anymore. But American audiences don't respond well to that. They find it boring. They find it repetitive or redundant. And I said, how do I fix this for young viewers? How do I make it work for young viewers? So at the time, the biggest show on TV was The Walking Dead. So we partnered with Robert Kirkman, who was the creator of The Walking Dead, and said, hey, I want to bring you onto this project. It's a nature doc. And it was a challenge, right? Because I wanted to tell a nature doc through the lens of a horror movie. And that idea came from we had to make up kaiju and King Kong and Godzilla because nothing chases us and eats us. But if you're a mouse, if you're an impala, if you're a frog, if you're a lizard, your monsters are actually real animals actually chasing to eat you
Mm.
every day. It's the same story we tell in nature films, but we tell it not through that lens. So what if we tell the story of sunset to sunrise, survive the night, predator prey relations? And the actual content is predator prey relations. What I never wanted to do was demonize the animals. And in 3 episodes, we kind of actually demonized people, which I kind of had fun with, kind of giving a conservation message, but very hidden. I like to say, like, kids eat kudos bars because the granola is covered in chocolate. You got to bury the vegetables a little bit to reach this audience. That's the non-nature audience with nature.
Mm.
But my end goal was I said, I want this to get to younger viewers. I want to see younger viewers, that demographic, watch nature, because that's the one at the time was doing the worst. And I don't know, personally, it was a little like, that's a little scary because you watch like each demo and the young people are the least interested. I'm like, that's a problem. That's not good. We broke the record on Hulu for young viewers with Dead by Dawn, which was a 6 part
Really?
natural history series. Most of it's available on their YouTube, on Nat Geo Watch YouTube now. But it was 6 part, 3 people in the field over 6 months. So it was myself, my friend Devin, my friend Ryan Powers, and we did the entire thing all at night for 6 months. And like I said, it was really well received with that demographic, which is what I wanted to do. I was like, can I change the lens just a little bit without changing the content, without changing what we're talking about, and draw that audience? So personally, to date, I think my biggest success has been Dead by Dawn. Even though it didn't get a second season, it hit that demographic and started a broader conversation, especially with the folks at National Geographic and even a couple other networks of what if we do it a different way? And now there's been other kind of nighttime, different sounding natural history shows. There's been a few comedy takes, which is actually something I'd also pitched. But the kind of creating a new genre of natural history where it's still natural history, but it's not in the same tone. We don't always have to do the orchestral. And the other thing we changed with Dead by Dawn from how natural history is usually presented is we didn't do it as pods. It wasn't like, here's a sloth. Now in Madagascar, here's a lemur. And it's like telling a story, but bouncing around the world and bouncing around stories. And we said, that's not very narrative. It's not a story. It's just kind of a lesson. And we wanted this to be a story and not a lesson. So we actually would get a segment. So say we found a flying gecko and filmed that. Well, if the flying gecko lands on the land, now the next segment we had to pursue had to be on the land because it had
Mhm.
to seamlessly connect as it was encapsulated as one night. Obviously, it wasn't one night. It was, and you can't get that much action in a night. But the story was a single night, and if we wanted to go from the tree, then we had to follow a Kaluga up the tree. If we had to get down, then a flying gecko had to take us down. Now we're at the vampire crabs. The vampire crabs go to the water. Now we're in the water, and we're kind of following the direction of these scenes, which was a lot of okay. We have this. How do we piece this together? But at the end, what we got was a fluid story where it's like if you don't see the hedgehog in one scene, he's going to come back later in the episode hit by a car. Spoiler alert, but it's
Mhm.
been a few years. And I think that too was something that showed, hey, natural history isn't necessarily dead. We just need to find new ways to tell the story. Now, luckily, and this is the good news, natural history is going back up with the younger demographic quite significantly. So the current young generation is starting to engage it, which is great because Dead by Dawn was developed in 2015, shot in 2017, redeveloped in 2016. There was a few iterations trying to fine tune it. And then I've got another show that I can't announce yet, which kills me, but it's another kind of nature reinvention that come June, I'm hoping is also equally well received, but another weird way in because I feel like if I make a nature doc that's just the classic nature doc, I'm only going to preach to the choir. And for me, to find purpose in my work, I want to reach people that don't care about nature because
Yeah.
people that do already do.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's really well said. It's sort of the issue that people who produce on YouTube have a problem with as well. It's like you want to hit the general audience because you want to bring new viewership in, and you want to and to do that, you kind of have to be a little bit sensational, but you want to keep the content less sensational. You could see TV shows that go the wrong way, right? They draw in general audience by just being insanely over sensational, and you end up
Yeah.
with a show that's not really about natural history at all, and it's really just goofy. You won't find any of the nature lovers watching it, and then the people that do watch it are probably going to even forget about it because it was just a piece of entertainment for them, and they move on. So you kind of have to strike that balance.
Yeah, and it's difficult too because, like, a lot of the people producing TV shows are TV producers. I produce car shows, and I'm not a car person, so it would be wrong for me to go, "How dare you produce a nature show?" And you're not entirely a nature person because we do hop around from genres and topics, and there are a lot of nature enthusiasts, even biologists, natural history producers, but there's a handful that aren't, and there's a handful of commissioners who are buying them that aren't, and they chase the numbers. And the sad truth is, and this is just the straight up sad truth. Megalodon was one of the highest rated Shark Week shows of all time. People
Hmm.
do thrive on stupid a lot better than they do kind of intelligent content. So for folks like me who want to still get viewers, but and YouTubers empathize with them, trying to get the viewers without going that way. Because I know I could write the shows that would get blockbuster ratings. I would be embarrassed by them and not want to be associated with them.
Yes, yeah.
Um, my friends and I, who are also producers, will joke about the like, oh, that would be big. I don't want to be a part of that. And just got
Yeah.
let's not talk about that anymore. Someone might hear it. And it's
Well,
tough.
I
It's
had
hard.
Paul Rosalie on years ago. I don't know if you know if you're familiar with him, and he
I
he
know,
did,
Paul.
yeah, yeah. So and he did Eaten Alive, and in hindsight, he's like, it was really goofy. It didn't really have the effect that we thought it would have, and he said, and it got cut up in a way that he wasn't really privy to because you're in the field filming, and then you get to see the end product, and you're like, wow, that was not what I thought we put together. And it's just this thing where it's like, you're getting attacked by electric eels and all these kind of crazy things, and but
I spoke
people
to
watch it.
Paul. I spoke to Paul about that show. In fact, I was hired to consult on that show and ended up believing it. There was a lot of changes in the field, and I can back Paul up on it. It was like if the anaconda is not the right size, then we can't do the thing. And but his heart was in the right place. That hey, this is why people are going to watch, and then I could tell an Amazon conservation story. And
Yes.
I think Paul's kind of story is that if the show isn't what you want to do, you need to figure that out early on and be cautious that things can change. And if you see a road where it could get worse, it probably will. Probably not the best way to put it, but like if you're joining a show that already has a sensational kind of top line, expect the rest of it to kind of follow that top line.
Yes.
Even if that's not how initially you think it's going to go. But I mean, for what it's worth, I think Paul really, matured and grew from that difficult experience for him, because he does have a passion for the Amazon. I don't question that for 1 minute. He has passion for conservation. He did something that obviously was hyper sensational and really looked down upon, but I don't think he or his heart were in the wrong place, and I've seen that happen to other people. So that's why, like, I'm like, yeah, give the dude a break. He thought that,
Yeah.
like, he because let's be honest, would Paul have ever gotten a 2 hour special about conserving the Amazon rainforest? And they talk about, in that show, they talk about mercury pollution from illegal gold mining and the effects on the anacondas. And there was other people in that show on his crew that I'm still in touch with that are now studying at Brian Fry's lab doing reptile work, herpetology, and they're furthering their education. And it's awesome to see. And there were good messages in the first like hour and a half, but the last half hour of sensationalism is what sank the show. But
Mhm.
the truth is, they wouldn't have gotten the show without that, and that's the decision that like everyone has to come to. And I think sometimes you go, you know what, we'll just see past that and make the show, and then like Eaten Alive, the message didn't get out there because the sensationalism was so heavy. That's all anyone paid attention to, and I think unfortunately the message was lost in the packaging.
Yeah.
But yeah. Very aware of that, and it's a classic example. At the end of the day, the audience always wants sensationalism, and if that's not the story you want to tell, you're gonna have to find a new way to tell it to avoid it. And that's what Dead by Dawn was an exercise in. Like, it's gonna have a scary voice and scary music, but there's nothing sensational said in the entire damn show. You
Yeah.
you can't find something to complain about because we deliberately made sure we avoided it. But it's hard, and even 18 years experience, there are shows that I start to develop and I go, oh, that could go the wrong way, and I back off from them because what happened to Paul happens a lot. And
Yes.
really, as a talent, you don't have a lot of power in that situation. You're under contract and you
Yeah,
just got
that's
to
kind
keep
of what he
going.
said. He's like, it's just, he's kind of a naive in a situation, never been in this position before, and you just sort of have to
Hmm.
go along with it, and you're kind of forced. Your hand is forced, but you like I said, you can learn a lot from that experience. And anyway, I feel like we could talk about TV shows for so long with
Yeah,
you because
yeah.
it's just fascinating, and I love the direction you took with Dead by Dawn. I think that's brilliant, and kind of having to reinvent the wheel for different audiences is super clever. But I would love to talk about aquatic snake keeping because that your admin or admin on the Facebook group, I guess is that the correct term? And you help write a book, and there's lots there. So I would love to know about just in general, like when did you start aquatic snake keeping to begin with? You talked about this being your fascination from early on. The best part about providing high-quality reptile husbandry is you get to develop a long-term relationship with your animal. Meet Jackson, my 18-year-old crested gecko. Jackson lives on the Bio Dude's Terrafauna substrate, which is one of their substrates that's specifically designed for warm biomes and humidity spikes. Like all other Bio Dude substrates, it contains organic content to help support the plant life in Jackson's vivarium. It also holds moisture very well, which means humidity is never an issue, even in my dry climate. Another favorite of mine is the Bio Dude's Bug Grub. This is a supplement powder made from natural ingredients like carrots, beets, spirulina, oats, and potatoes. Everybody knows how important gut-loading feeder insects is, and this simplifies it for me and allows me to be confident when I feed both Jackson and my tarantulas that they're getting the nutrients they need to thrive. Also, if you have a lot of babies right now, this is a great way to help fortify the diets of neonatal reptiles. The BioDude has a ton of great educational content on both his YouTube channel and the website, all about bioactive care, and it's just one of those brands that's doing their part to push herpeticulture into a positive direction and give reptile keeping a better name.
Yeah. So I think like most kids, I start off, I grew up in Hesperia in the Mojave Desert catching lizards, and I graduated from lizards to snakes. And my first exotic was a ball python. I still have her. I got her at 7 years old in a mall pet shop and rolled up in a ball. And then I think 8 years old, I got San Diego Zoo season passes for my birthday and saw the tentacled snake tank, and I was just fascinated. Like, my brothers were annoyed. I was just staring at it, but I didn't want to leave it because here's these weird twig animals just sitting there in an ambush posture, and I'm like, I want to see what they do. Like, this is strike pose, but like, I've never seen it. I need to see what they do. And I just sat there and waited, and there weren't hardly any fish in there, and Herpeton don't just regularly feed unless there's like a school of fish or grazing throughout the day. So I wasn't going to see it. I missed it. But I said from that point, oh, someday I'm going to have tentacled snakes. I didn't actually get to work with aquatic snakes until I was 19. I had 10 aquariums. The ideas of 10 snake aquariums, terrariums. The idea of adding water to the equation wasn't going to happen at home. So I had Nerodia and Thamnophis quite a bit, and I had a huge Nerodia collection because I think for me it was just aquatic snakes, you get to see them behave more naturally. You're not introducing a mouse or rat and then they're eating and then you're putting them back in their enclosure, right? It's not this kind of systematic, here's your food, okay, I feed you. It's the food's in there, watch, and they will
Mhm.
act like the predators that they are. So I really enjoyed that about kind of all of the aquatic and semi-aquatic snakes, that it's a little more natural observation than something that you have to feed individually. You know, you don't just let mice run around with your snakes unless you're a terrible keeper. It's something I enjoyed about the vine snakes because I'd stalk a lot of anoles and then they'd have to hunt on their own terms, I guess. And you could see their strategies and you start to observe things like, is that caught alluring? Oh, she's ambushing the spot that I always feed them from. Cool. I'm going to keep feeding them there. And that's actually how I learned to do feeding stations on aquatic snakes, which is something I do. I feed sinking food to all the fish, always in the same spot. The snakes learn the spot. And then a lot of the time, if I feed uh, that spot, the snake will assume the position and feed right in front of me, so I can make sure they're actively feeding. But yeah, so the first exposure with this is San Diego Zoo, and I'm actually I'm hoping someday to work with them with aquatics. I've been talking to them about that because my passion would be to give back and give an enclosure that does the same thing for someone else. But yeah, so it started with tentacle snakes. From there, I met Philippe Devogely, and he was working with Homolopsis, so I bought all his Homolopsis. I went to a reptile show in 2003, and Myke Reef from Reptile, but at the time, Yakub was at Life Import Cargo Reptiles, and they had brought in a Philippines Acrocordus granulatus, which are the black and blue ones. Absolutely the best. That's the premium marine file snake. They look like a sea snake in that dark blue and light blue pattern. And even though the Philippines doesn't export reptiles, they classified Acrocordus granulatus at the time as a sea product because they were catching them when they're catching the ocean stuff. And the Philippines exports a lot of fish for the fish trade, for the pet trade. So it came in that way. I'm not sure if it's still the same export setup because but those days they'd come in with the fish. Bought that thing, read Lily White's paper, which was written in 91, which actually have Lily White coming to the International Herpetological Symposium as her banquet speaker, which has me super stoked because so much of his work's been influential to me. But he had written a paper in 91 about their care, and they only had them for about 8 months. So when I had mine for 4 years, like, huh, this is good, right? This I'm doing good at this. And then my tentacle snakes bred, and I realized that I had always kind of had there was a living room fish tank that was my fish tank, but stayed in the living room, and I loved to experiment with that as a kid, and I think I'd learned a bit about fish. And I said, okay, if I'm going to get really good at this, I'm going to have to get good at fish. And so then I started keeping reef tanks and different things to really learn water chemistry and challenge myself. And it was funny because people were like, you're not a big reef keeper. I'm like, no, I've spent like $50,000 on that thing, but I'm not a reef keeper. I'm doing this to teach myself water. I want to learn water and water chemistry and filtration and fish care. So I really kind of had these like fish side projects to learn the aquatic snakes because the skill set's more fish than is herp care. I still keep some terrestrial snakes, but the aquatics have always been my fascination for a few reasons. Reason number one, like I said, you get to observe them, like Javinicus creating air bubbles to breathe off, and hunting and caudal luring and mating behavior, and just right in front of you. And these are snakes that live in mud. I mean, Homelopsidae, the family's name is the mud snakes, and acrocords live in murk and muck. So these are a lot of these observations. You might be the first time to have actually seen them repeatedly. And so I started taking notes, and I've shared those notes with folks like John Murphy, who's the lead author and editor of the new Aquatic Snakes book, that's on HCI's website, but also Evolution in the Mud, and really a huge name in Homelopsidae. And he's like, yeah, these are new observations. So for me, it's kind of fun that like there's literally scientific observations to be had in keeping. That's rad. Also, I don't like to consider myself a trend follower, but I've always kind of loved bioactive and complicated tanks. I said at the beginning, I'm pretty ADHD. I get bored really fast with stuff. Like a lot of people are like, "Oh, didn't you have like a whole bunch of vines?" I'm like, "I did. I switched away from them because I'll have like have side projects, and I kind of I go, okay, but they're breeding. There's nowhere to go. Aquatic snakes, I've never hit that dead end. I'm still observing. But once bioactive came in, I always tell people, well, there's no more bioactive really than an aquarium because it's bacteria that's filtering it. But also, I've got crabs and shrimp and cleaning crew and non-food fish and food fish. Like there's layers of life going on in the same ecosystem, or micro artificial ecosystem. And I love watching like shrimps cleaning tentacled snakes and going, I wonder if that's beneficial. Like they have parasite or not fungal issues in captivity. I wonder if the breeders, because they get that algae and the biofilm that shrimp love to eat, I wonder if shrimp in their native range plays into it. I don't know. It's fascinating to watch, and it's another thing that I eventually want to start looking at. Like, let's do two tanks, have one with shrimp, have one without shrimp. Do we see a difference in the improvement of care? Um, and there's just a lot of room to innovate and create things and find new ways to do things that are challenges. It's not easy, but it's also fun. Like for example, if you're doing a big 150-gallon tank, you usually have a hang on the back return so that the water kind of comes up and down, but it's designed to give like an inch of space from the lid to the water line. And for a lot of snakes, that's not enough. They need actually some space to breathe. They bump the lid, it scares them, it stresses them, especially like elephant trunk snakes. If your lid's right on your water, they're going to bump that. It's going to cause a lot of necessary stress. So, then I spend months working on new arrangements for lowered filtered intakes. And I have one, intakes to the sump. And now I have one that I need to make a YouTube video of because it works really well. I don't know. For me, there's a lot of room for that. And then there's no care sheets. So figuring out how to care for them kind of requires diving into their ecology, which is I love herp ecology and I love field herping. So Aquatic Snakes bundles it because I'll often go to the natural habitat of where these animals are from. I can make habitat observations, but I can also bring my own water test kit and evaluate the water and go, okay, well, so far, every time I found these animals, the pH is lower than 6.8. That might be an indicator. Or when I find these animals, they're tucked under the bank, so the enclosure needs to have a bank for them to tuck under. There's a few helicopters. I've only found them that way, where the grass kind of covers the edge and they're right in there. Ungulatus is pretty indiscriminate, but some of the others are specialists. Cerberus always in mud and brackish, so I have a small group of Cerberus and I try to replicate that. I went to the Solomon Islands on a Shark Week show called The Real Sharkano. I created the show. I should admit this, but the reason I had looked into it was because I really wanted to go to the Solomon Islands to check these snakes out. So I was like, is there any cool shark stuff here? And it turns out there was a lot of cool shark stuff there. So I'm like, I'm going to write a Shark Week. It's going to be a good show, and I'll get to go to the Solomon Islands and see these animals in the native range. And I did.
That's
I found
genius.
a and those are the granulatus that I keep and breed readily. And I'm working now. My big project is to try to see if, like in brackish fish, I can work them away from their need of salt. Because brackish is hard to keep balanced. They do need fresh water. So getting them freshwater drinking water is a challenge. There's ways to do it, but my current project is actually to try to get my F2 generation inch closer to salt freshwater. So by F3, they're actually freshwater, which there are freshwater occurrences. But if you take an animal that is naturally in a brackish environment and keep it freshwater, Lily White and others and myself have all found the same thing. They die.
Yeah.
In about 9 months to a year, they die. It's just not what they're adapted to. So I've been moving the mother snakes into very tannic hypoxic environments where fungus cannot survive, but freshwater. Unfortunately, fish can't survive. So long term, keeping that way is kind of a dead end because they can't eat. But you can temporarily keep in that environment where Opidiomyces, that's what the white spot fungus they get is actually SFD. I've sent multiple biopsies back and I've never seen anything else come back. So at this point, I'm pretty, we've always called it white spot. Like, oh, what's the Asian white spot? And so I started doing biopsies. I wasn't happy that there wasn't a name for the pathogen because how do you treat something you don't know what it is? That was another side quest. Now we know what it is. Unfortunately, now it's a really bad thing because
So
SFD
it is snake
is,
fungal disease, the same snake fungal disease you see on terrestrial species?
yep.
Interesting.
And that same snake fungal disease affecting terrestrial species is starting to affect some of our aquatic species in the States.
Mm.
And it makes sense because if you look at the populations of snakes affected by snake fungal disease in the United States, it's like our timber rattlesnakes in the Northeast. They spend a disproportionate amount of time in the cold hibernating. Snake fungal disease is not resilient to heat and dryness. So any animal that can get out and bask tends to recover pretty well. And I think snake fungal disease in the trade has probably existed a lot longer than we thought. We know it goes back to the 50s, but I remember they'd call it scale rot.
Mm.
And some of those scale rot illnesses were snake fungal disease. But a lot of snakes can bask it out. A fully aquatic snake cannot. So the white spot fungus that acrocords get, I've never had a biopsy not come back SFD. For tentacled
Interesting.
snakes and homolopsis, there's an array of fungal pathogens, but the primary one you see in aquacords is snake fungal disease. And unfortunately, that means the water's contaminated. Anything you touch is contaminated. Anything that water touches is contaminated. If you do a water change irresponsibly down your driveway and gets in a natural water source, you could wipe out the snakes in your own area, especially things like mud snakes and swamp snakes and anything that doesn't often leave the water is going to be more affected. Anything that's in a colder range or doesn't leave the water, because 91 SFD stops reproducing, 95 SFD dies. But if you're an animal that doesn't leave that water, it's going to wipe you out. And zoos have had problems with bushmasters getting SFD and dying for the same reason. It also recurs quite a bit, and the treatments we have for it aren't that good. So that's actually why I haven't spent too much time pursuing the commercialization of aquacords because I think they're kind of like that's a gremlin. I'm not going to sell
Mm.
mogwais on the internet. If I don't know you're a responsible keeper, you're not getting one because the risk to the environment's too big. And as much as I am a lifelong keeper and passionate keeper and passionate that keeping is actually helpful to conservation. So I know it's a sidetrack, but HCI, Herpetological Conservation International, has a grant for early career herpetologists. Most give it to people working on their PhD, and we're evaluating this year's grants right now. And we ask people, what got you into reptile conservation? It's almost always a pet. Almost
Yeah.
always a bearded dragon or leopard gecko. That's conservation, reptile conservation's best recruiting tool. We need that. It's what helped me become who I am. And so many people have that same path. So I'm definitely a passionate keeper. Asterisk, however, if I have to choose between animals in the wild or animals in captive care, I would choose the wild every single time. So that's why I've not strongly pursued, I have tons of granulatus offspring, but none of them have left here yet. If the right keeper comes to me and I know they're not going to just drain their water down their driveway, or I have a lot of people asking, can you keep them in a pond? I'm like, yeah, if you want to kill all the snakes around you.
Yeah.
So
How would you
another
dispose of the
side tangent.
water? How would you dispose of the water safely if you knew that it had contained an animal with SFD?
So it depends on a few things. If your sewer situation is like mine, and I'm on a septic tank, dumping into the septic tank is perfectly reasonable because it's not actually going to another water source; it's getting absorbed into the ground. Um, if you're on sewer, definitely check out what your sewer system is because you there is a chance you could expose an animal that way. It is heat. It is very affected by heat. So when I have an animal with SFD, if I remove it to the treatment tank, I actually use a couple instant boilers, which are like these metal rods you get off Amazon, and they just get the water boiling hot.
Mm,
And I bring the water to boiling because that will kill SFD, anything
right.
above 95. So another option is heating up the water before you dispose of it. Bleach kills SFD. For disinfecting anything that the SFD touches, though, the problem with bleach is you're going to stain your house white unintentionally. And what most people don't realize with SFD, which is I think is one of the bigger concerns and fungal pathogens in general, is that yes, there are some published studies that say it is not that resistant to rubbing alcohol or hand sanitizer. However, that's not a sporicidal. My wife is actually an infection preventionist epidemiologist, and she's like, in hospitals, that would never pass standard because you need a sporicidal to kill the spores.
Mm,
There is a product that's accelerated hydrogen peroxide. If you don't want to bleach your house, accelerated hydrogen peroxide. So we use accelerated hydrogen peroxide, which is a specific formulation. It's got a very quick kill time, a very effective kill time. You spray it on within, I think it's 3 minutes, the pathogen is dead. So I actually have one of those Swiffer mops loaded with accelerated hydrogen peroxide. And anything I do in any of the aquatic tanks, the whole floor is Swiffer mopped. That way, if I drop something and pick it up, I'm not potentially contaminating the glass. If I get water on it, little of the accelerated hydrogen peroxide. It's non-toxic. I wipe it on the glass. My hands, everything has to be treated as contaminated because every drop of water could have the fungal spores and spread it from tank to tank to tank to tank.
right. Well, and that just shows you that like there is this much extra layer of complexity when you're dealing with aquatic snakes, and I feel like they are such an underrated thing. And you could have people who are brilliant fish keepers who might want to jump into this world as well, who haven't even really thought of it. Can you quickly, for people listening, just your standard kind of rough definition of what you would like the aquatic snakes versus the semi-aquatics? I think most people will just intuitively
Yeah,
know
yeah.
what this is, but maybe just to lay it out.
Yeah, no, for sure. And what's funny is I've actually spoken at a fish show and I've spoken at fish clubs on this topic because predatory fish keepers are fascinated by them. And I realized no one's really taken them on
Introduce them.
seriously. Yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
exactly. So I've actually spoken in Florida and South Carolina, kind of been flown around to different fish groups talking about this because they're actually better suited than most herp keepers generally to take on something like this. So when I say aquatic snakes, I'm meaning primarily fully aquatic snakes. The family Homolopsidae, which is a family of Southeast Asian colubroids, are the vast majority of them. Like Homolopsis, rice paddy snakes. Rice paddies are probably the most terrestrial of them in that they'll climb on sticks out of the water at nighttime, but that's about where it ends. The rest of them, I usually offer a landing shelf. But if you see an aquatic snake, a member of the family Homolopsidae, on that shelf, that probably means something's wrong. So I actually only have those in there for two reasons. One, it gives me a plant area to grow pothos, which extracts nitrate and stabilizes the water. But more importantly, two, if the snake isn't feeling well, it's going to go up there. I now know something's up. Let's investigate. If I don't have that shelf, the snake has no way to do that. No way to tell me, hey, I don't feel well. So knowing that their natural behavior is to leave the water when they're ill, I do leave that space, even though in most tanks, it will never, ever, ever be used. So for the fully aquatic snakes, that's family Acrocordidae, which is your elephant trunk snakes and your marine fowl snakes, and then Homolopsidae. Most of them are rear fanged, but they're all very, very aquatic. Now, there's a few, I'd say, borderline full aquatic. Some of your helicops are more aquatic than others, which are from South America. But generally speaking, I leave it at Homolopsidae and Acrocordidae because the rest, I'd say you'd really have to deep dive and see how important that land is. Because animals that do have a small portion of their ecology on land, you need to offer to them. Oftentimes, that's important for that fungal cycle. I wish they all crawled out of the water because rice paddy snakes are infinitely easier than the rest. And I think part of it is, well, they often dry out at night. So the fungal pathogens don't have as much time to grip on between shed cycles. So yeah, and that's where I tell people to start too. Like if you want to get into aquatic snakes, don't start an elephant trunk snake, please. I've seen too many of them just not make it past a year. That's a very long-lived animal. It's not supposed to die in a year. Most people think they're doing great because that snake has resting metabolic rate of one heartbeat every other minute. So it takes a really long time for your
Is that
scripts to show
real?
up. Yeah,
That
yeah.
wow.
The slowest resting pulse of any vertebrate animal. Also, the most thorough digestion of any snake, so they really don't poop. A lot of really weird granulatus have the most blood and the most viscous blood. That's why acrocords are negatively buoyant and sink because they have such thick blood, and their lungs are so vascularized. When you open them up, it doesn't look like lungs. It just looks like thready tissue because they absorb the oxygen, they exhale cutaneously. I mean, they're amazingly weird adapted animals, but because of that, they're also very particular in captive care. And everyone thinks they're cool and wants to start there. And it always pains me when I see it. And I see it all the time. Anytime someone has a problem with the granulatus, it feels like whether and around the world, I've had rescues in the Philippines and Australia. They're like, hey, what do I do? And it's like they're already at the point where it's almost too late or too late. If I have one message for anyone that's like, I want to get into aquatic snakes, please, for crying out loud, start easy because it's not an easy part of the hobby. I've worked with some of the more difficult terrestrial herps and I put them on their own special level. Now, tentacled snakes can be easier. I'd say that's mid range, but if I tell anywhere to start, it's like puff faced water snakes. They come in pretty colors. They come in morphs. They're pretty durable. They're less prone to issues with sopranidae. So goldfish and minnows, they're carp. They have thymidase. Garter snakes are super sensitive to thymidase. A lot of species are. Homolopsidae aren't that susceptible. Like they're not affected acutely with the neurological issues. Some people have kept them full time on that. It is a part of their natural diet. I did try one colony of full-time goldfish because the readily available fish. And I said, let's try it. If I notice issues, obviously add B1 and pull it back. But let's see what happens because I knew a very, very respected breeder who knows his stuff, who's only feeding goldfish. What I did find was by year 4, I was getting a lot of slugs, and then it became all slugs. So it did affect reproduction, and I do think it has some impact, but the nice thing about your puff-faced water snakes is a goldfish every now and then isn't going to kill them like it will the rest of them. Rice paddy snakes, the nice thing is they're small. They're 10 inches. You could do an air filter, a sponge filter like you do for shrimp and some sticks, and they do just fine. Just plant up a tank. They do well in bog tanks. So I'd say you start at rice paddy snakes or puff-faced water snakes. You work in some anhydrous, and then maybe try something like a tentacle snake and herpeton, where now you're dealing with black water, and now you're dealing with specific pH because tentacled snakes need specific pH. They need black water, or they do have fungal outbreaks. And I will say that I have one colony that right now is showing signs of fungal because during breeding season, when they're chasing each other around, that adds stress, and so you have to separate them back out if you start seeing the health decline. Which is another thing about breeding aquatic snakes. Most of these species, I forgot to add this. One of my favorite things is most of these species do better in groups.
Mm.
Um, when you find, say, Homalopsis in Indonesia, you tend to find 20. When you find one, you just find the one spot they're at. The most snakes of any one species I've ever seen in any one night was Cerberus, Bacadams, in Indonesia, Schneiderei. And we lost count before 400, but probably hit somewhere in 400 in a single night of the same
Wow.
species. These are animals that actually do well in groups. Additionally, they need a lot of fish in their tank. They're not always the best feeders, but having multiple snakes going after the same fish causes chaos and it allows them to feed better. So in tentacled snakes, if you have one tentacled snake in a tank, its feed success is significantly less than if you have four. Problem being during breeding season, they have to watch them very closely. The males will start losing weight because they're not eating, and the females will start stressing and getting fungus. So that's when you then have to separate back into male and female groups as is needed. And that's where we get into tentacled snakes, where you do have those issues. Whereas puff-faced water snakes, if you keep them together their entire lives, the only thing you have to watch out for is the male being too inclined to breed and maybe not eating enough. So
Mm.
in mine, I'll usually have the male go back to his own tank to get his body weight back on. And then once breeding season comes, he just hops from female tank to female tank. But sometimes you have to put him back in his own because they're just so focused solely on breeding. They kind of forget that eating's important too.
Are they all live bearers?
Yeah, yeah. So
Okay.
all your kind of goes with being aquatic, right?
Yeah, yeah.
If you don't like leaving the water, you're not going to come up on dry land. And, as someone who worked quite a bit with Beluga, which can be pain in the butt eggs, it's kind of nice just going, oh, there's the babies.
They're there. Yeah.
Yeah. Except then you have the chore like I have right now. I've got these elaborate life planted setup. Life planted is so good for aquatics because it pulls out the nitrates so you don't have to change the water as often. And I think a big mistake people make with aquatic snakes is when your water values are off, like say your ammonia starts creeping up, they'll overcompensate and make the water perfect. And treat aquatic snakes more like coral. I keep telling people that treat it more like coral. Because if you have coral and your water values are off and you change it too fast, you kill it. The coral's better off you leaving it as is and gradually moving it back to good than making it good right away. It can't handle the change. And I've noticed in aquatic snakes when I have a tank that's really bad, and I record keep every time the snakes blue, every time they shed, anytime I notice anything. I've got charts for all of them, and I start noticing that, oh, I did a really big water change there, and then it went from bad ammonia to fungal outbreak. Is that because the ammonia prior or because the water changed? But then I also started seeing correlations to any big changes, and I realized these aren't animals that adapt to any rapid change whatsoever. That and I found them in sewer systems. The spot with the Cerberus was the grossest place I've ever herped. In fact, I sent a friend there and she was hospitalized from going in the water. It's behind a crematorium where the sewer kicks out into the ocean. So you have like
Oh my gosh.
human remains and sewage and a huge population of snakes. I've also seen Homalopsis and anhydrous in kind of the rough village. We'd probably call it more of like a slum type area where it's kind of homemade homes, but it's an impoverished part of Java, and they kind of all have sewers that kind of just run down to like a open cinder block vat, and tons of homelopsis in there. So I also think to a certain extent, it's good to remember these things don't occur in pristine conditions. They occur in specific stable environments, and stability is everything.
Right. Well, it goes back to the slowness of their metabolism, right? It's you're steering a cruise liner, you're not
Well,
steering a tiny little boat.
So that's the acrocords, and this is the other fun thing about them is like Acrocordus javanicus has like a almost dead metabolism, and then you jump over to like most of your Homalopsis, and they're hypermetabolic and have to feed it like consistently. So there
Oh,
is a range in
interesting.
that. So like javanicus, the elephant trunk snake, that's like they could go a year without eating and you'd hardly notice a weight change. In fact, for the first several years when we had our T negative albino, we weighed her monthly. And I stopped because the disturbance didn't seem worth it and she was maintaining a healthy weight. But Richard Schein's lab published a study on the average weights and tail lengths. And that's why I try to keep them in because that's a species that can become obese in captivity because of such a
Mm.
low metabolic rate. But conversely, yeah, that rule doesn't apply across the board because a lot of these animals, if they go without fish for very long at all, they're hypermetabolic and you will see body weight loss and conditioning issues. And even that varies species to species. I mean, you in the family home lobs today, you have everything from shrimp specialists to crab specialists, eel specialists. And each of them have their own niche, which is why you can have the diversity of so many species in such a small area, where you'll get a lake. Like I was just in Vietnam a few months ago, and we found, let's see, Homelopsis Merrill J. coxi, Bacort's water snakes, and anhydrous in the same tiny pond. So to have that many convergent species, they each need their own niche. And that's another really cool thing about aquatic snakes is each of them kind of have a very strong specialty. So they can occur in huge numbers among each other. So it's like if you find anhydrous, going to find 50 anhydrous, 20 homoopsis, 10 Bacort's water snakes, because it's where they are, and they're each filling out like a special spot that they've carved out just for themselves. And again, for me, like I love the ecology side of things. So it makes the care of them more fascinating, where I'm like, okay, well, I've only seen Bacorts in kind of shallow water, so let's try them in shallow water. And now that I'm working with Bacorts, holy crap, you put them in deep water, and they're the clumsiest, dumbest swimmers I've ever seen. You're yeah, you're not good at this, and that's supposed to be your thing. But
Yeah,
anyways,
yeah. Can you tell us a little bit of how, like setting up a tank? I know obviously, just as you're mentioning, it's probably quite a spectrum between species to species, but just in general, like, is it just like setting up a fish tank, or what are you doing?
yeah, so it does vary species to species. Like with tentacled snakes, you're talking about a black water tank, but there are some general rules that I follow for everything but tentacled snakes. Rule number one is I never fill a tank all the way. Three-fourths. I like to have that airspace. It gives them room to breathe. It gives you a spot to put your pothos for nitrate extraction. It gives you a place to put a landing shelf, so they can indicate if they're not feeling well. So my basic setup on smaller species, even a homelopsis, 40 breeder. I get some egg crate and some pond foam. I silicone in the egg crate to the back. I pond foam it. That's what creates that shelf. I fill that with aquatic planting medium. And then filtration can vary species to species. Some species like Homelopsis don't mind flow. So in a 40, I might just throw a fluval U4. I remove the carbon. Carbon strips out tannins. I add tannins to most of my water. Catawba is my preferred tannin of choice, although I also mix in coastal oak and sycamore and a few others. Um, and then a lot of hide. Enough hide that the snakes are hard to find. If you can walk in there and see the snake easily, or see the snake every time you go looking for it, you did it wrong. It should be like you only see them when you see them. That's why you do the feeding station to draw them out, or go in there at night with a flashlight, which is what I do. During the day, you never see them. You shouldn't be able to. That's too exposed. They don't like being exposed. Preferably anything larger, which is what I like to do. Then you do sumps, but you're hanging on the back, the little Tetra filters or the top fin filters that are just carbon. Those are useless.
Mhm.
Carbon removes color and it removes odor. It does nothing for your actually nitrate nitrogen cycle. So getting a test kit and making sure you don't have a load of nitrates and ammonia or nitrites in there is going to be really important. A good pH test kit, but yeah, so it is like a fish tank, but there's some modifications. Another modification is substrate. Gravel is not ideal for them. Pool filter sand works pretty good. But alternatively, now that I've moved to an area with really hard water, and I am using RODI for the most part because of that, I've been using a lot of aqua soils, which are volcanic ash compressed substrates, often using a little peat. And like fluval stratum locks the water in between like 6.0 and 6.5. So you don't have to chemically alter the pH. So I have been doing a lot more aqua soils and like them. So substrates a consideration. Species to species flow is, do I do an in-tank U4 that's powerhead driven, or do I do a sponge drive? And surprisingly enough, if you have a really, 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 really planted tank with a thick soil bed, which actually helps a little bit too with the filtration process. I'm running a handful of 40s now on air driven sponge filters and having phenomenal results, because that sponge filter is enough for the nitrites, but the plants are doing all the work for the nitrates. And those stable tanks only need water changes like every year. Still testing the
Really?
values, but not seeing them drift, because the plant, as long as the plants are growing, they're consuming nitrates. That's
Yes.
why, even though I think pothos are not my favorite plant in the world, to be perfectly honest, I still often will utilize those and other surface plants, because the
Mhm.
surface plants are growing vines. Chop the vine, constantly chop it all the time. As long as the plant's growing, it's working. Once it fills in the space available, it stops growing, then it's going to stop working, and you might not realize that your kind of natural filtration systems died off. So that's the other reason. Like I do aquatic plants in the water. Certain species, it doesn't work well because they tear them out.
Mhm.
They're moving around and they're anchoring to them and ripping them out. But those top surface plants where you can trim, sweet potato, buy a sweet potato, save a part, let it vine. excellent for removing nitrates. And then you can get silly and have them coming out the tops of the tanks if you want. I've seen people do Monstera, Adansonii, and a few other species out of their fish tanks to extract nitrates. But utilizing that in an aquatic snake tank is a great way to go because they need the stability.
Yeah,
So
yeah, yeah. Now,
I'm
what
trying.
about? I was just say, what about like water temperature, and are you heating the water, or you? How does that work?
Yeah. So that adds a layer of challenge in terms of what you populate the tank with. For example, I do like to add shrimp to my tank, but there's only some species that can handle the heat. So for like tentacled snakes, you're looking at 78 to 82. For a lot of the other species, it's 80 to 84. I do allow like some of the species within further north range to get a little cooler in winter and get down to like a 78 low at night. But for the most part, 80 to 84 varying species to species. For example, my puff-faced water snakes are 82 to 84 most of the year. In the winter, I let them get a little cooler. But there's not a huge temperature variant in their native range, and I haven't seen a huge change in reproduction results. Also, they're not something you have to cycle. They're going to breed. If they're healthy, they're going to breed and reproduce. These are very reproductive animals. The challenge isn't getting them to breed. The challenge is actually getting them to stay alive.
Mm.
But that higher temperature does pose a challenge to certain plants, fish, and shrimp. So I'd say if you're looking into this, make sure each species you look into what are their temp requirements because it's easy to mismatch pH and temperature. And that's the other thing. Most of these snakes are going to be a pH below 7, anywhere between 6 and 7 is the pH range, but the vast majority prefer. And so that was going to change which fish do and don't work as both your cleanup crews and your feeder fish. And the reason I add that extra other fish is because in a normal fish tank, you use catfish to rummage around the bottom, and you need something to stir that up because when it gets really densely planted and you have all your manzanita wood in there and everything else, it's hard to properly clean it. So having an animal actually stir that up is an important part of that. But don't do catfish. Why? Well, there's a dorsal spine. Don't do plecostomus. Why? If your snake swallows it, it might die. That's when you end up in crustaceans. Now you're looking at panther crabs. Panther crabs are good. A lot of other crabs, like red claw crabs at PetSmart, are aggressive towards the snakes. It's a no-go. So there's a lot of layers to it depending which species you want to pursue. But that's also the fun research part. That's the fun part where you get to deep dive in crabs and go, I guess I'm going to learn everything there is to do to learn about crabs because I need a cleaning crew. But I use a lot of panther crabs. I use some red apple crabs more for entertainment purposes on those guys. But the red apples it will clean up dead fish pretty
Mm.
quickly. So I love throwing those in because like if they'll hang out on the top and then just like grab stuff off the filter intake and use that as food, and I don't have to feed the crab, but it's keeping my intake clean. Like I said, the cherry shrimp are great little scratcher around. I'm not sure how effective they are. A mono shrimp are better for algae, but they do end up on the snakes, so I leave them because it seems like that might have a benefit. And then fiddler crabs are fantastic cleaning crabs that leave everything alone. Red claw crabs could not recommend. Vampire crabs inappropriate. They're not really carrion feeders. They do great on crickets. I've actually filmed them for a show. So, but there's a handful of those. So yeah, it's layer. The other thing I didn't say though is you do need a secure lid, and fish tanks don't come with
Mm.
those. So you're going to find yourself buying aquarium silicone and sponge and filling in the holes while your plugs go in. And the other thing is the regular tube heaters can be dangerous to aquatic snakes. So
Yeah,
like your
that's what I was
quartz
thinking.
heaters, they might wrap around them. They could burn themselves, as snakes do. If you had like a hot rock or anything else, they're often not great about not burning themselves. But there's been innovations there. So the company Higer makes these dual tube in a plastic case where they aren't really in direct contact with it, and I've had no issues with those. And the thermostat's external, which is important because if you're not running an external thermostat, way too many people, including myself, I actually lost my first massive colony of Homelopsis years ago from a heater overheating and turning the water to like 105 degrees when I got home. And of course, the snakes were cooked. So having that external thermostat on your heater is super important because otherwise you'll be like the rest of us. And at some point, your heater's going to go bad and you're going to cook your animals. And that's a hard day.
Yeah, yeah, that's definitely good advice. And the feeders you had mentioned. So when you're, is there certain species of fish that you consistently use, or and how does it work? Do you just throw a bunch in and then you're waiting for the fish population to be decreased until you add more?
Yeah, so there's a variance species to species in this as well, of course. But I will say the vast majority of these snakes aren't great at feeding when the fish numbers get low, and in some they stop feeding. And I have to wonder, and this is again just that it sparks curiosity, if there's something ecologically going on when they don't feed when there's two or three fish. Because I've had it where it's like could have totally caught it, completely ignoring it, fish swimming right by, hasn't eaten, and I'm like, come on, eat the last fish. And certain species won't eat the last few fish. And you have to wonder if there's a certain thing with like an elephant trunk snake that's in a water. If the fish population gets too low and it wipes them out, it has no food, but it can go a long time between meals. Is there something ecologically when their numbers get low, they stop feeding because they will wipe out their own food source? I don't know. That's purely speculation. But I will say that some species, when the fish numbers get low, they just stop feeding. So obviously, you need to see what your aquarium can handle in terms of waste load, in terms of nutrient load to keep the chemistry. You don't want to break that and crash the tank, which then you get too much ammonia, they get bacteria bloom, and you have to start the whole cycle over. But I kind of run it right up to that point because the more fish, the merrier. And then when they get low, I restock. My main base feeder is mollies. Unfortunately, those are not readily available on the West Coast as feeder. On the East Coast, you can get what they call live bearers, which are also often platies. Excellent. For smaller snakes, mosquito fish. Listen, for babies, guppies, perfect. I'd say tentacled snakes can live on mosquito fish their entire life. Minnows do still have thymidase. They'll deplete B1 and eventually you'll have neurological breakdown. Like I said, I've also noticed fertility issues. Additionally, goldfish are a fish that prefer it cold. So that 84-degree water temperature, your feeder fish might die in your tank, especially in winter, because a lot of these are outdoor raised. So they're coming from a really cold pond into the pet store, into your tank. They're not ready for that. And in fish shops, they actually have massive die-off in winter of feeder fish where they make profit on them in the summer. And a lot of fish stores lose that profit in the winter. So their feeder fish break even. They only keep selling them because that's what brings people back into the store, but they often don't make profit because goldfish don't like warm water. And if they're coming from a cold outdoor breed to an indoor tank that's 70, they lose half. Then they go to your tank at 84, you're going to lose the other half. Ammonia bloom, everything dies. The other problem with goldfish, a lot of ammonia. And finally, high fat content, low protein content, and indigestible scales. So I do avoid goldfish. Minnows are fine for fattening up. But my base feeder is mollies. Another great feeder is look at your state regulations, but a lot of states have restrictions on tilapia, but not across the board. So, like in California, for example, I can't use Nile tilapia. They're a restricted species, and I make sure I stay on top of those rules, so I'm not working with something I'm not supposed to. But Mozambique tilapia you can get for 50 cents. So you get a big cattle trough. I actually have a cattle trough run to a hydroponic system. I grow microgreens that cleans the water, and then I'm growing up the tilapia to be the appropriate sizes for my snakes. You can get those for 50 cents. So you do have to do a little bit of like pre-work to get that tank running and get them up to the various sizes. But tilapia are base. And then I'm also working with a tilapia farm to start breeding mollies for the pet trade. And hopefully in the next few years, we can get that going to the point where the fish I use, mollies, are readily available. Now, the reason I use mollies is these mollies get like 4 inches. So they fill almost every feed niche I need. And additionally, they're salt tolerant. So for my marine file snakes that are brackish, I can use them in both. But so are tilapia. So if your state allows tilapia, excellent feeder. But
Wow.
again, it's not going to be straightforward. They can eat anything that's not a carp, doesn't have a dorsal spine, and so like my elephant trunk snake, she doesn't really eat much tilapia. She mostly eats cichlids from cichlid breeders. I have all the local cichlid numbers, kind of have my number. I'm like, hey, if you get something with a short fin, or it's they have culls where it's like something's born wrong. I mean, the same as really more frequently because the quantities are more frequent, but the same as like a snake breeder. If you get born a snake born with one eye, you've got that decision if you're going to cull it or not, if it's kinked, if it's all warped. So I've got all of these cichlid breeders kind of on dial going. I'll take any surplus of any sort. And so she eats cichlids. Sometimes it's electric yellows. Sometimes it's Oscars. Like I got a whole batch of Oscars in with ick. I don't know what to do with it. Okay, cool. Snake food.
And that's no
So
issue for her to eat it with ick.
ick isn't. No, ick isn't. And honestly, half the time it's easily treatable. When it's a batch of fish with ick, I'll throw them in a hospital tank before I throw them in the snake tank just so it doesn't give the rest of the fish ick. But for like a large scale operation where they're like, all right, I'm going to write these off. Do you want them? I'll be like, yeah, let me see if I can, what I can work with. And then if any die, I stick those in the freezer and I reprocess those into fish food. Rice patty snakes have actually now gotten onto frozen thawed. So I'll save, like if it's something that just died in transit, I'll just stick them in the freezer and feed the rice patty snakes because they eat carrion, which makes sense. They're in shallow water pools that will often dry up. So they'll opportunistically eat any carrion. Fantastic. That means I can do frozen any fish. Which again is why I keep saying that that's a great place to start because you could probably feed it for free. Walk in your local fish store, ask for the dead fish, and go home. Probably not the best way actually because there might be parasites there, but we freeze it first.
Yeah, yeah,
Um,
yeah.
but no, I'd say it's a mix of opportunistic fish purchasing, the mollies that I self harvest from the Salton Sea, and then tilapia. But
Okay.
again, check your local regulation when it comes to tilapia because there's a lot of state restrictions. And I would say if you're in Texas listening or Florida, if I lived there, I'd be catching the invasive species because
Mhm.
I think using invasives for a purpose is a great way to actually put some pressure on the environment or on the population. And granted, you're not going to fix the problem, but if you're going to spend the money for the fish anyways, why not do something good at the same time? When I was raising Otula, I was feeding just browner nulls for that reason. I was like, well, I'm going to go through 1,000 anoles a week. I might as well go through brown anoles. So yeah, if you're in an area, and by the way, USGS is a resource for that because my main feed, the 1,000 mollies a month I go through, I catch at the Salton Sea, and I found that out from USGS. They publish all the invasive species in your state and where they are. So look up fish your state or near you, and then go catch them and feed your snakes to this fish that don't belong there. Be a part of the solution. So yeah, my mollies, I found on the USGS website that there was drainage ditches with these mollies that could pose a competitive threat to our native pupfish. And I'm like,
There
I
we
can
go.
help. I can help with that.
That's awesome. Okay, that's great advice. I never would have thought of that. Last thing, because I know I want to wrap up, I want to let you get back to work right away. For waste, like the snakes pooping, and like the conventional reptile persons, you're going to scoop it out. When you're dealing with aquatic snakes, are you cleaning out any waste, or is that all happening with the filtration, just like a fish?
Filtration like fish. So I will say, my Bacorts right now is an early project, and those can get 4 kgs, and I'm not sure what their waste looks like. For the most part, these snakes don't have a lot of solid waste. Occasionally, you'll get a little bit that you can like siphon out on a large homelopsis, but on Herpeton, filter takes care of it. That's what the crabs and the shrimp and the cleaning crew take care of. On elephant trunk snakes, there's almost no solid waste. They have the most knotted intestinal tract of any snake, and by the time that comes out the other end, there's almost nothing left. So
Okay.
there's very little to remove. But yeah, the filtration takes care of it. So if you hate poop, I've got good news. No more picking up poop.
I think a lot of people, our ears are going to be perking up. Just in general, like the amount of the complexity of the project that taking aquatic snakes on, I think is fascinating. And you're obviously in a wealth of knowledge in this domain. We'll have to have you back on at some point again to talk more about this. I want to make sure that people also know of the two nonprofits that you're a part of. To mention that, and the aquatic snake book that they can get through the Herpetological Conservation International, right? That's what it's called. Because
Yep.
there's people that are going to want to dig into this way deeper, and they absolutely can. So, can you talk about that?
Yeah. So the Aquatic Snakes book, which is a fundraiser for HCI, Herpetological Conservation International, was founded by myself, my friend Devin, who's a herp keeper, field herper, and also television producer. Dr. Chip Cochran, he doesn't like when I have the doctor, so I always do. Who's a herpetologist. My friend Luke Basluto, who's with the National Parks Conservation Alliance.
He's been on
My
the show
wife.
before, yeah.
Oh, cool. Yeah. So Luke's on our board. Luke's a good friend from way back, actually, way back. So that's awesome that he was on here. Basically family, that kid. Um, yeah. So we wanted to offer conservation within the trade. Like I was doing RACA, which was, Reptile and Amphibian Conservation Auctions was what that was an acronym for. I always do acronyms. I don't know why. That one was Jordan Russell, and we're raising money for USARC, and I think we raised like 300 something thousand dollars on Facebook
Wow.
auctions in a very short period of time. And I've done two USARC fundraisers before that. This was the one where it's like let's partner up with Jordan, and we did that for a few years, and it was really successful. And it got me thinking because I was listening to the points the AR side was saying, the animal rights, right? That reptile keeping is the antithesis of conservation. And I said, well, we don't have a lot of conservation coming from like actual field conservation coming from within us. What if we found a nonprofit organization where 0% of the money went to our pockets? Because, a lot of times, like, I don't want to give $10 to that organization, or I know it's going to eventually execs and like 5 cents goes to cost, where
Mhm.
we actually fund the overhead ourselves, the board. We don't pay ourselves and it actually costs us money, but the mailbox, the website, we pay for that. That way, every dollar goes to cost. And we're at herp shows because we are fellow keepers. We are conservation that doesn't hate the hobby. We're actually for the hobby. That's what recruits reptile conservationists. So that's kind of where we started, and we've expanded into different projects. But John Murphy is definitely a mentor and a friend. And I went out to his house in Arizona, mainly because I thought two localities, Acrocortis granulatus, might have something funny going on, and I wanted to look at it with him. So I brought some specimens and we're talking, and I was like, I've always wanted to write a book on sea snakes because I obviously I love sea snakes, one of my favorite animals on the planet, and it crushes me that they're always in the very back right before the index, and there's hardly anything written on them. And the only way you can get a book on sea snakes would be to buy every book and then combine them together. You got 69 species and there's not a book on them. And then you have the sea crates, there's no one book on them. And so I told him I'd really like to write the field guide to sea snakes of the world at some point. And he goes, well, I was going to revise Evolution in the Mud, his book on Homelopsidae, but instead he's thinking about doing a bigger one that'll include nature scenes and a few others. Why don't we work together? So I joined the project to write the sea snake and sea crate section. And then, of course, with my obsession with aquacords, I ended up stepping in there a little and writing in that section as well. Justin Bernstein, who's also working with HCI for Aquatic Snake Conservation Grant, he wrote a huge portion of that because he's really becoming a name. Dr. Justin. I love calling people Doctor who don't like it because I was going to do the same thing. But Justin is a major author in there. Zach Loafman's another author. But what we did was we got 14 authors together, over 100 photographers, and wrote the most extensive book ever on aquatic snakes. This thing is 4.6 pounds. It has a boatload of species accounts, anything with aquatics. So from Malabar pit vipers, anacondas to acrocords and sea snakes. So it's not specifically just for aquatics, it's every aquatic snake in one book. Now, it doesn't go in depth necessarily on any topic to where you could like say acrocords. I think it's like probably 30 pages a book, and I'd love to see a book on that. But it's everything. So you could just flip through it page after page, species after species. And I guarantee you, there's no way you have heard of all the species in this book because as I was getting the chapters from the authors, I was like, what? So, anyways, as we're getting about 4 years of working on this thing, it was a big project. John came back and was saying, hey, I heard you're thinking about doing some aquatic snake projects. I'm like, yeah. And he goes, well, I'd love if you'd consider honoring his mentor, which is Harold Voris. And I'm like, oh man, if Voris would have it, that's amazing. He's a titan in the. So we named the grant after Voris. And John came back and he said, I want the proceeds from the book to go to the Voris grant, the first grant for aquatic snakes specifically, which was awesome because this was John's labor of love. He spent every waking moment he'd be calling me, what do you think of this map? And it was a real joy to work with him on it. But the fact that this has become our big fundraiser for the aquatic snake grant is that all the credit there goes to John because he just he's a great dude and he wanted to do something powerful. And I think it's a huge book and there's nothing like it ever written. So you can get that on our website, which is herpconservation.org or herpconservation.com. We have both. At the top, it'll say the aquatic snakes book. I will say at close to 800 pages and 4 pounds. It's not the cheapest book to print, and it's full color photos. So we also have a ebook version for a much smaller donation. It's like I think $20 or something for just to keep it accessible because we want the information out there. But at the same time, it is a fundraiser for a grant that we've already funded conservation projects for Cerberus microlepus. The Lake Buhi Dam, which is a fully aquatic snake in the Philippines on Luzon Island. And then we've also funded telemetry on narrow-headed garter snakes in Arizona because that's a semi-aquatic snake. And the study is very fascinating. And we've got a few other we're working on. So the books brought those funds to allow those studies to help conserve these animals because from a non-captive situation, aquatic snakes have two threats, both water quality and land. So they've kind of got a double hit and they're very understudied and most of them are IUCN data deficient. So we saw a need there. So the aquatic snakes book was kind of after there. And like you said, it's a great place to get started and read. None of these animals have care books. There's no care guides. There's no complete Acrocortis. So you're going to need to start at books like that anyways. And you'll find your fascination with the habitat. Maybe you'll find a species that I don't work with that's aquatic that you will be the one to pioneer and become super, known for both good or bad, But
Yeah.
I don't know. I guess that's not to circle back too far, but I enjoy pioneering a lot. I enjoy finding the species that haven't had success and finding what it was to make them successful, which kind of segues into my other organization, the International Herpetological Symposium. I can't call it mine because it's a 50-year-old organization. And quite honestly, when they said, we want you to be president, I'm like, me? Well, I mean, the rest of the board is like Vicky Poole from the Dallas Fort Worth Zoo, who's like breeding gharials, and Justin Eldon in the St. Louis Zoo doing like, to me, like way more worthy board members than myself. But I was honored and obviously was going to say, yeah, of course. My first IHS, I was 22 and I skipped my 2-year wedding anniversary to attend. So it's an organization that's like, in fact, it's always over my anniversary. My wedding anniversary. But the International Herpetological Symposium is really unique. It was started in the 1970s when if you were a herp keeper, you were also a field herper because there wasn't anywhere to buy snakes and no one was breeding them yet. In fact, the first talks on breeding leopard geckos were at IHS. The first talk about incubating corn snake eggs was at IHS. Reptile shows were born from IHS banning reptiles, which most people don't know because IHS was the first reptile exchange. It was held at hotels. People were trading reptiles in their hotel rooms. That got out of hand. I just banned it. And one of the board members, happened to be Wayne Hill, was like, well, we could just do the reptile trading part as its own thing. And reptile shows were born from IHS. But everything from like schooling herps, that talk was presented at IHS. So a lot of cool herpetoculture heritage. But what I like about it beyond the heritage is that I've presented there and I'll be talking about breeding granulatus. And the next person on stage is someone like Harry Green or, big names that are well-respected herpetologists, titans in their field. And to have that kind of mix of the hobbyists being able to interface directly with the academics and the zookeepers, heads of zoos, you don't get that anywhere else. We're kind of all otherwise compartmentalized. And for me, like when I started dealing with SFD, University of Florida was there, and University of Chicago, and I'm like, hey, tell me about nebulizing with terbinafine. I want to know everything there is to know about that. And then I talked to a zoo that had an SFD breakout and what they were doing, and like the kind of contacts and networking you get at an IHS that anyone could go to, you don't get at a herp show, and you don't always get at a symposium specialized just to pets, and you're not going to get at a symposium specialized just to academics. This is the everyone is welcome, we all love herps, so let's share what we know meeting. And I think that's really special. I mean, I've got contacts with zoos that I made through IHS. I've got lifelong friends that I made at IHS. And yeah, so that's why the International Herpetological Symposium, which I know I keep abbreviating it, is why I'm passionate about it. And we're having our meeting this year at Thai Parks at Iguanaland. 49th year as an organization. And I don't know, I think in-person meetings and that real face-to-face networking and getting to meet people that answering each other's questions just in their first meet, like, wait, what? There's just so much potential and so much opportunity. And that's why IHS is my other organization that I'm passionate about and dedicate time to. Because, for HCI, I want to give conservation that the herp community can get behind and look out for these species that are really missed, like critically endangered bacadams in the Philippines that are IUCN extinction is imminent without some intervention. No one's funding that. Let's do it. And then IHS. Hey, you want to get into herpetoculture or herpetology or zoo, or you don't know which? Hang out, meet
Yeah.
people, find your path in this crazy hobby slash study slash practice slash everything that it is. If people attend and they say, hey, this helped form my career or passions or hobbies, that's what we're there for, and that's why I'm doing it. That's what's awesome to hear.
Yeah, I love that. I always say, you go to an expo, and quite often it's a lot more fun talking to the people than actually looking at the animals, because getting to, sit down with people and ask questions is, the best part. And I think the reptile hobby has such a unique opportunity because we are such nerdy people who are overly involved in this to make the connection with the scientific world and give ourselves a little bit more credibility rather than just people that keep snakes in their basements. So anyway, Myke, this is a fascinating conversation. You have just such a crazy amount of knowledge, and I think we could just continue talking forever. I want to let you get back to work. So can you please, and we will, for listeners, we'll definitely have Myke back on because there's just so much more to unpack, I feel like, but can you please let everybody know, you'd mentioned some of the websites, but where can they find you? Where can they find the content that you produce?
Yeah. And I'd absolutely be more than happy because, like, when we deep dive down a certain species, it's just as complex, but it's a totally different direction. Like, if you ever want to wrap tentacled snakes or apricords, anytime.
Yeah, I'd
But
love
yeah,
to.
I'm on Instagram, Facebook, and regrettably TikTok as just my name. MykeClarkson.com. I always say regrettably TikTok because I haven't figured it out. I feel like you got to figure that one out. And I was like, but anyways, if it's still around, I'm on there too. But just MYKE. I spelled my name wrong, Myke Clarkson. And that's for any social media. For the websites, it would be herpconservation.com or .org, both work. And that will get you to HCI's website. That's where you'll find out about the books. You'll find out about the grant projects. Browse around, see what we're doing. And then also for the symposium, that would be iherpsymp.org. So iherp and then symp.org. Probably going to add some new domain names to that. We actually had an issue where we lost a little and got a new one, but that is our domain. That'll always be one of them. That has online registration. There's a really cheap student discount, and the registration is less now than it will be come May. So if you're thinking about going, definitely check it out. And if you have questions about any of the organizations, feel free to reach out and email me. But I'm really active on Facebook and Instagram, and I jokingly complain that everyone's always coming to me with questions, but honestly, if I can help someone in their journey or I can help their animal, probably even more importantly, when someone says, "Hey, I've got a sick snake," the only reason I'm not like, I've got 1,000 things going on, I don't have time to spend an hour on the phone, and the reason I still will jump on, usually text, I'm not a big caller, is because like I care about the animal. I want the animal to have its best shot too. But yeah, social media, just my name, herpconservation.org, and then iherpsymp.org.
Awesome. And I think the symposium is in June. And also for those who are actually more interested in digging deeper into the aquatic snakes, they can also check out the Aquatic Snake Keeper Facebook group, I think it's called, right?
Yeah, it's so I actually didn't found that group, but I am now admin on it.
Admin, yeah, that was the word I was looking for.
Josh Arvin founded it when he was working with Helicops, and then I came in and obviously became an admin on it. And it's a semi-aquatic and aquatic snake keepers group. I share it occasionally on my Facebook. If you just message me, go, "Hey, what's the group?" But that's a great group because there's a few thousand people in there, and comparing notes is everything when you're, as I like to call it, pioneering. When you're working with something that isn't well established, the best thing you can do is talk to other people that are doing the same thing and learn from each other's mistakes. Because in the end of the day, that's going to help you save the animals who keeps lives if they found a mistake that you haven't found yet.
Yes, absolutely. And big shout out to Josh. He was the one that pointed me in the direction of you to have you on the show. So thanks for that. And
he's a good dude.
Yeah, he's great. Myke, thank you so much for being here. This was fantastic. I can't wait to have you on again. So it was a pleasure chatting with you today.
Yeah, thank you so much.
All right, that is the end of the episode, Myke. Thank you so much for joining me and telling your story. It's fascinating listening how these negative experiences or the events in your life that can be interpreted as negative end up giving you this total new lease on life in a way and sending you down a path that you just didn't think was even possible. So thank you for sharing your story, and thank you for giving us an overview on aquatic snakes. I think it's an absolutely fascinating part of reptile keeping that I've never even discussed. I've never even really thought about. So listeners, again, if you enjoyed this episode and this was enough to really get your feet wet, no pun intended, into this group of animals, then let me know and we can do an absolute deep dive on one of these species or maybe a few of the species to give people a little bit more of the content that would allow you to care for them successfully. But I just wanted to give us a broad overview of what this is because it's such a complex and large topic, and hopefully this is enough to pique your interest. And if we want to do more, please let me know in the comments. If you enjoyed the episode, make sure you share it on social media. That really does help to bring new audience members in. If you're looking for more information on the show, you can head to animalsathomenetwork.com. If you'd like to support the show financially, you can do that over at patreon.com/animalsathome, or just subscribe on YouTube, keep up with the content there. And I believe that is it for this one, everybody. Thank you so much for watching or listening, and I will catch you in the next episode.